All over the world, sacred books are dying in the slow fire of dust returning to dust. All over the world, efforts are being made to save them, even if for just another generation. All over the world, they're being copied as a spiritual exercise and adapted to new technologies for wider dissemination. The hunger for them is irrepressible, like these Russian translations of Jewish books, samples at a recent Moscow book fair, swept from the shelves in minutes as soon as the doors were opened. The Jews have had a long love affair with their texts. Always on the move, often driven away or persecuted, they managed, nevertheless, to preserve and hand down their books. And, most important, they have in every age renewed them through study and interpretation. Hello, I'm Edwin Newman. I'm standing in a synagogue of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. This room was once the library reading room. The seminary has one of the greatest Jewish libraries in the world, and scholars came from everywhere to study here. In this room, generations have read the texts to the rumble of the Broadway subway right outside. In the beginning, says the Torah, God created heaven and earth. Well, commented the rabbis, maybe not exactly. In the beginning, even before heaven and earth, must have been Torah. The word, the book, comes first. Simply by turning a page, Jews enter their history and keep it the present. Through learning, they keep alive a never-ending discussion of man, God, time, purpose, duty, world. And a Jew studying Talmud today in Manhattan knows that he's arguing the text with a Jew who studied the same words in France in the 12th century or in first century Palestine. In the world of material things, what is unused is new. What is used grows old. But in the world of sacred texts, what is unused dies. What is used grows increasingly vital. Jews view themselves as partners with their texts, and their interpretations join a long conversation recounted from scholar to student, from parent to child, passed along through centuries, a family treasure. Well, what have the Jews been studying all these years, and why? Joining me is Rabbi Ismar Schorsch, Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary.
When the library was opened in 1930, this reading room had the appearance of a synagogue, and I think that that was intentional. It is sacred space. So when you enter, your eyes are immediately carried to the other end of the room, where there are two magnificent candelabras, an elevated platform called a bima, and then at the top an ark where the scripture is contained. In this case, the manuscripts and rare books of the rare book room. Like many synagogues, there's a Hebrew inscription at the front. This Hebrew inscription gives the contents of the rare book room: scripture, Talmud, law, non-legal commentary, history, science, religion, poetry, literature.
No Kabbalah, no mysticism.
No, the founders of this institution were rationalists and were somewhat offended by the excesses of Kabbalistic interpretation.
One of your most highly esteemed predecessors here at the seminary, Rabbi Louis Finkelstein, said, "When I pray, I talk to God. When I study, God talks to me."
I'd like to believe that when we study, we also talk to God. There is an old rabbinic midrash to the effect that God spends 1/4 of his day studying Torah. Why should that be? He wrote the book. I think he studies Torah because he wants to hear what our commentary is like. So when we study, there's a partnership. We speak to God. God certainly speaks to us.
Now, can you demonstrate that through these inscriptions?
Well, I think the significance of that inscription relates to the philosophy of this institution. On a mechanical level, the inscription classifies the holdings of the rare book room. But on a more profound level, the inscription tells us something about the breadth and the diversity of the Jewish past. That rare book room sought to include everything Jewish. And finally, that inscription says something about the way we understand the Jewish past. To be a specialist, you've got to be a generalist. Your knowledge has to be contextual, integrated to the full range of Jewish experience.
Rabbi, how can it be rewarding to be studying the same texts century after century, maybe even millennium after millennium?
Sacred texts in Judaism are filled with infinite meaning. Every generation writes its commentary. Judaism is an inverted pyramid. The apex is Scripture, and on top of that apex, you have layer upon layer of individual commentaries.
Does that mean that the texts are being reinterpreted?
Every generation.
On this program about text and tradition, on the Word and its many interpretations, the Genesis Seminar is key. The Genesis Seminar is a group of New York writers and scholars, editors, novelists, filmmakers, and others who are carrying on a venerable tradition by studying Scripture, not to reach a conclusion, but to form a community. The best conversation in New York, they say. The deeper we read the text, the more we see ourselves. After 4 years of working their way through the book of Genesis, a few passages at a time, they have returned to the opening verses.
God said, "Let there be a dome amid the waters, and let it separate waters from waters." God made the dome and separated the waters that were below the dome from the waters that were above the dome. It was so. God called the dome heaven. There was evening, there was morning, second day. Dome is I suppose, one translation. It's translated a million different ways, my favorite being firmament, because I have no idea what it means.
Dome, you understand?
Dome? It's the Hebrew is rakia, and rakia is something that's kind of beaten flat. It's for metallurgy. And I suspect, I'm not really sure how Genesis understands this, but I have a fairly good beat on how the rabbis understand this. They kind of see the earth, and then there's kind of a hollow space, and then there's rakia, this very thin layer. Well, it depends. Some rabbis think it's a very thick layer. And then there's heaven, and then there's another rakia. Rabbis from the 9th century onward are flat earthists, and they bend over backwards to try and figure out how the earlier rabbis could have thought the earth was spherical. But they're pretty explicit about it. George, or any of the Bible people, does anybody have a beat on whether the Bible reads, what is this dome? Is it a ball in a ball in a ball? Is it?
It refers to the sky.
It's always sky?
I think so.
It's a technical term, yeah. It's in Job, where it's hammered out. I think of those tin ceilings in the old New York buildings that have been hammered out very thin, but it's very hard. I think that's why the Latin uses firmamentum, because it's something that's hard.
Jerome says firmamentum, but it's so abstract.
They figure just you need something strong to keep all that water up there?
The water back, that's its function. Yeah, now, my commentary, Westermann says that the Phoenician behind it has is used for the word bowl.
So dome's nice.
Where you get the dome idea, yeah.
It's used in Ezekiel, in the description of the appearance of God on that chariot. And over the chariot, over the beasts that are bearing the chariot, there is something, it says, of the color of a rakia, or something of the kind of a rakia, ke'ein rakia. And that seems, from the context, to be a platform. It doesn't specify whether it's flat or spherical or round or what, but that's another notable use of the expression.
Right, of the color of electrum, I remember the
That's
translation is.
Earlier in the chapter.
What is that color, electrum? I've always wondered.
Amber, they say, but that's earlier in the chapter. Here, it doesn't. It's not in connection with.
That was good, Ray. Amber, just like that.
What the Hebrew school? It's chapter 1, verse 23. Not the amber, but the platform. Or the
You're in
rakia.
Ezekiel. Right?
Ezekiel, yeah. It seems to be true to the picture the Bible's trying to give of everything sandwiched in between. Like God somehow makes space between water in order to find a space for the universe.
I don't see it that way. It seems to me that first you have this chaos, which is a kind of watery chaos.
Yeah.
First the darkness is on the chaos, and then God himself is hovering over this chaos-like darkness, and then you have this first act, which is the creation of light, but then you have an even more radical, and that's good, but then there's an even more radical act. Light is meant to stand for day, and then the darkness is meant to stand for night. So these cries into this gloom, this murkiness of the Greeks. You know, this is day, this is night, this division, and that enormous work is day one.
I don't think it necessarily contradicts the picture. I mean, it doesn't have to be a strictly logical picture.
No, but it doesn't seem to me to be a world so much of sandwiching, but a misty, confused, hazy world which needs theatrical lighting.
I think Ray's point was really important, though, because he wasn't saying that that the earth was sandwiched, but that the act of God on day 2 was an act of creating a space in which life could exist. Because before God begins to create, there's just water, which is chaos. And somehow, we don't know where that water comes from, but God has to deal with that water before there can be life and order. And so the act of creating the rakia is an act of making a place into which human life, and as we know it, can be set. So maybe Mark, you were misled by the word sandwich, but I think Ray's point is really important for this picture of the universe.
I think what God creates by naming it is the concept of light and day. Now it's possible to have light and darkness.
That's he or by or. There's light, be light, light. And only then is there separation.
But you can't separate them until you have the idea that this is possible. And by naming it, I mean, you can't think about anything until you have a name for it. So you call it that, and now it is possible to have it in fact.
Jewish study is not sedate. As the old joke has it, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. The Talmud, the codified differences of opinion of scholars who lived more than 1,000 years ago, has been debated out loud for 1,000 years. There never was a time when Jews at every level of society did not examine and re-examine these arguments.
So the Mishnah goes, Hitkachili b'kos zeh shel yain. If somebody says, be betrothed to me with this cup of wine, v'nimtza shel dvash, it turns out that it actually was a cup of honey. Shel dvash v'nimtza shel yain, or vice versa, if he says, listen, be betrothed to me with this cup of honey, and it turns out that it was actually wine, and I assume that wine is more valuable than honey. Is that?
Yeah, they're not of equal worth, certainly. Right. That's clear.
Yeah, okay. So it's in one case it's either intentional or unintentional misrepresentation. But Rabbi Shimon disagrees, and he says no. You can if he made an error which was to her benefit. In other words, if it was not to her detriment, if it was to her benefit, whether it's an intentional or an unintentional misrepresentation, then she's betrothed.
Which, by the way, also shows that it's not doesn't say she can then accept it. It says that she then is stuck being married.
She's stuck being married to someone or being betrothed to someone on the basis of a misrepresentation.
But she can't be stuck. If she wants to accept being sold short, but she wants to marry him anyway, why shouldn't she be able to?
See, what
on the other hand, if it's to her benefit because she's getting more than they said she was going to get, great. That's also nice too.
But I don't
see what they need.
I think you're giving her a lot more seichel, a lot more understanding of what her situation is than these rabbis would give her. I mean, I think that you're right that they were guessing what she would like. And we can know that their guess we might know now that their guess was wrong.
So Rabbi Shimon is saying, as long as it was to her benefit, in other words, we're making this decision for her. And Rabbi Shimon says, as long as she's better off than she thought she was, she's betrothed. Whereas the Tanna Kama seems to say, no, we want a woman to know what she's getting into. We don't want her to be deceived either way. Because you wouldn't want to marry, in other words,
my mother told me to marry a rich man.
Right.
I did.
Got it. Right.
Right. That's it.
Okay, so now we